October 17, 1777. A British general stands in an open field near Saratoga, New York, watching his army, the finest fighting force in the world, lay down their weapons before a ragtag collection of American farmers, shopkeepers, and backwoodsmen. 5,800 redcoats, defeated, surrendered to an army that wasn't supposed to exist. This wasn't just a battle. This was the moment the world realized that the impossible had become inevitable, that the British Empire could bleed, that a revolution born in Boston taverns and Philadelphia meeting halls could actually win. But how did we get here? How did an army that captured Fort Ticonderoga in a single morning end up trapped in the forests of upstate New York? Starving, desperate, and surrounded? This is the story of the Battle of Saratoga, the campaign that changed everything. Not just one fight, but weeks of brutal combat, brilliant tactics, catastrophic mistakes, and personal drama that would echo through history. This is the story of how Daniel Morgan's riflemen revolutionized warfare, how Benedict Arnold became both hero and villain on the same battlefield, how a Polish engineer and a German baroness shaped American victory, and how Benjamin Franklin turned military triumph into diplomatic gold in the courts of Europe. This is the battle that brought France into the war, the battle that made American independence possible, the battle that proved democracy could defeat monarchy. Welcome to the Battle of Saratoga. Let's begin. To understand Saratoga, we need to go back 9 months to the winter of 1776 to 1777. When American independence seemed like a dying dream, George Washington's Continental Army was huddled in winter quarters after a devastating series of defeats. The British had driven them out of New York City, across New Jersey, and nearly out of the war entirely. Yes, Washington had won small victories at Trenton and Princeton on Christmas and New Year's, but these were tactical successes, not strategic victories. The British still held New York. They still controlled the Hudson River. They still had the manpower, the ships, the money, and the experience to crush the rebellion in London. King George III and his ministers were planning the campaign that would end the war once and for all in 1777. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Divide and conquer. Cut the rebellious colonies in half. Isolate New England, the heart of the Revolution, from the middle and southern colonies. Strangle the rebellion at its source. The plan called for 3 British armies to converge on the Hudson River Valley, that vital north-south corridor that connected Canada to New York City. If the British controlled the entire length of the Hudson, they could split the colonies, prevent them from coordinating, and destroy them piecemeal. Let me paint you the picture of British confidence in early 1777. The plan came from Lord George Germain, the British Secretary of State for the colonies. Working with his generals in North America, 3 armies would march, and where they met, the rebellion would die. The northern force would come down from Canada under Major General John Burgoyne. Gentleman Johnny, they called him, a member of Parliament, a successful playwright, a man who moved in the highest circles of British society. Burgoyne would lead 7,000 troops south from Montreal, down Lake Champlain, recapture Fort Ticonderoga, then march down the Hudson to Albany. The western force would move east from Lake Ontario under Lieutenant Colonel Barry Street. Ledger, he'd lead a smaller expedition through the Mohawk Valley, rallying loyalists and native allies, then meet Burgoyne at Albany. And the southern force, this was the key General William Howe, would march north from New York City with the main British army, moving up the Hudson River Valley to link with Burgoyne and St. Ledger at Albany. 3 armies, 1 target. The Hudson Valley under complete British control. New England isolated, game over on paper. It was brilliant in practice. Well, that's why we're here talking about it 250 years later. The fatal flaw was coordination, or rather, the complete lack of it. Lord Germain never sent clear, explicit orders to Howe about marching north. Howe, for his part, had other ideas. He wanted to capture Philadelphia, the rebel capital, to deliver a crushing psychological blow. He thought taking the city where independence was declared would break American morale. So in July of 1777, just as Burgoyne was beginning his march south, Howe loaded his army onto ships and sailed away from New York, not north toward Albany, but south toward Philadelphia. He left behind Sir Henry Clinton with a small garrison in New York. But Clinton had nowhere near enough troops to launch a major offensive up the Hudson. Burgoyne was marching into a trap, and he didn't even know it. The other two-thirds of the British plan had already evaporated. John Burgoyne was 55 years old in 1777. And he cut quite a figure, tall, handsome, witty. He was known for his elegant uniforms and his love of fine wine. He brought with him on campaign a personal baggage train of 30 wagons filled with champagne, fine clothes, and his mistress, who accompanied the army disguised as a commissary wife. But don't let the gentleman's reputation fool you. Burgoyne was also a competent soldier who had served with distinction in Europe. He believed in shock and awe-overwhelming force applied decisively, and he genuinely believed that most Americans were secretly loyal to the crown, waiting only for British protection to reveal themselves. He was wrong on that last count, catastrophically wrong, but we'll get to that. Burgoyne's army that assembled at St. John's, Quebec, in June of 1777 was impressive by any standard. 7,200 men, organized into 3 divisions. First, 3,800 British regulars, professional soldiers in their distinctive red coats, trained to fight in the linear warfare style that had dominated European battlefields for a century. These men could load and fire their Brown Bess muskets 3 times a minute, advance in perfect lines under heavy fire, and close with the bayonet without breaking formation. Second, 3,000 German soldiers from the duchies of Brunswick and Hesse-Hanau. The British couldn't recruit enough men at home to fight in multiple theaters. They were already fighting in North America, defending possessions in the Caribbean, and watching France nervously, so they rented troops from German princes. These weren't mercenaries in the modern sense. They were regular soldiers of German states, loaned out to Britain in exchange for substantial payments to their rulers. Baron Friedrich von Riedesel commanded the German division, a capable officer, who would prove to be one of the few bright spots in Burgoyne's campaign. Third, around 500 Canadians, Loyalists, and Native American warriors, primarily from the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. Burgoyne hoped to use them as scouts and raiders, leveraging their knowledge of the terrain, plus artillery 42 cannon of various sizes. A powerful striking force, the campaign began with stunning success. On July 2nd, Burgoyne's vanguard arrived at Fort Ticonderoga, the massive fortress on Lake Champlain that the Americans had captured from the British in the opening weeks of the war back in 1775. The American commander at Ticonderoga, General Arthur St. Clair, had only about 3,000 men to defend a fort that needed 10,000. When Burgoyne's engineers dragged cannon up to the top of Mount Defiance, a height the Americans had thought impossible to fortify, St. Clair recognized the game was up. The British could now fire down into the fort at will. On July 5th, he evacuated his garrison under cover of darkness. The British recaptured Ticonderoga without a major battle. In London, King George supposedly exclaimed, "I have beat them. I have beat all the Americans." In New York, American morale plummeted. It seemed Burgoyne couldn't be stopped. But then the wilderness closed in. From Fort Ticonderoga to the Hudson River was only about 25 miles as the crow flies. But Burgoyne wasn't a crow, and his army wasn't flying. They were dragging 42 cannon, hundreds of supply wagons, and 30 carts of personal baggage through some of the most difficult terrain in North America. The American forces retreating ahead of Burgoyne practiced scorched earth tactics. They felled trees across every road. They destroyed bridges. They rolled boulders into streams. They burned crops and drove off livestock. Burgoyne's army, built for European warfare on open ground, struggled terribly. They averaged less than a mile per day. Think about that. Less than 1 mile per day. Soldiers hacked through fallen timber in the July heat while swarms of mosquitoes and black flies tormented them. The German soldiers, in particular, suffered in their heavy woolen uniforms designed for European winters. And the native allies? They started disappearing. Burgoyne had promised them plunder and glory, but all they found was hard labor and slim pickings. Worse, an incident in late July would destroy any remaining native support. Jane McCree was a young woman engaged to a loyalist officer serving with Burgoyne's army. She was traveling to meet her fiancé when a party of Native American scouts attached to Burgoyne's force encountered her. What happened next is disputed. Accounts vary wildly, but the end result was clear. Jane McCree was killed and scalped. When news spread throughout New York and New England that a white woman, a loyalist fiancée no less, had been murdered by Burgoyne's native allies, the propaganda impact was devastating. Thousands of men who had been sitting on the fence, trying to stay neutral, grabbed their muskets and joined the militia. Burgoyne had wanted to terrify Americans into submission. Instead, he had enraged them into resistance. By mid-August, Burgoyne's army had shrunk noticeably. Native warriors melted away into the forests. Canadian militiamen found reasons to return home, and Burgoyne faced a critical shortage. Food. He sent an expedition of about 700 men, mostly Germans, to raid Bennington, Vermont, where intelligence suggested large stores of supplies were lightly guarded. It was a disaster. American militia under General John Stark surrounded and destroyed the German column on August 16th, killing or capturing 900 British and German troops when reinforcements were included. Bennington was a warning sign. The deeper Burgoyne pushed into American territory, the stronger the opposition became, and the weaker his own army grew. By September, when Burgoyne's army finally reached the Hudson River near Saratoga, they had been reduced to roughly 6,000 effective troops. They were tired, hungry, short on supplies, and a long way from Canada. The Americans, meanwhile, were gathering in ever greater numbers ahead of them. Now let's talk about the American side, because it's complicated, messy, and very, very human. The American forces in upstate New York were initially commanded by Major General Philip Schuyler, a wealthy New York landowner who came from one of the colony's most prominent families. Schuyler was competent, methodical, and strategic. He understood that he didn't need to defeat Burgoyne in open battle, he just needed to slow him down, harass him, cut his supply lines, and let the wilderness do the rest. Schuyler's strategy of trading space for time was working brilliantly, but it looked like retreat. It looked like cowardice. And in the summer of 1777, with Fort Ticonderoga abandoned and Burgoyne pushing south, Congress panicked. On August 19th, Congress replaced Schuyler with Major General Horatio Gates. Gates was a former British officer who had settled in Virginia before the war. He was older, methodical, and politically savvy, where Schuyler was aristocratic and reserved. Gates cultivated an image as a man of the people. Granny Gates, some called him, though not necessarily as an insult. He wore simple clothes, treated his men with respect, and knew how to work the political angles. But here's the thing about Gates. He was not a bold battlefield commander. He was cautious, defensive-minded, better at organizing than inspiring. And he was about to benefit enormously from the presence of two other men who were his complete opposites. The first was Benedict Arnold. Arnold was 36 years old, a merchant and sea captain from Connecticut who had become one of the Continental Army's most aggressive and successful combat leaders. He had led the disastrous but heroic expedition to Quebec in the winter of 1775. He had held back a British invasion fleet at the Battle of Valcourt Island on Lake Champlain in 1776. He was bold to the point of recklessness, brilliant in the chaos of combat, and absolutely convinced of his own genius. He was also prickly, proud, and perpetually convinced he wasn't getting the credit he deserved, which, to be fair, he often wasn't. Congress had promoted junior officers over him. Other generals received praise for victories Arnold felt were rightly his. He was constantly fighting with superiors, demanding recognition, threatening to resign. Gates and Arnold were oil and water. Gates wanted to fight defensively. Let Burgoyne exhaust himself. Arnold wanted to attack. To carry the fight to the enemy, Gates was happy to let his subordinates do the fighting while he managed from headquarters. Arnold wanted to be in the thick of it, leading from the front. They would clash spectacularly, but not yet. The second key figure was Daniel Morgan. Morgan was a 41-year-old frontiersman from Virginia. 6 feet tall, heavily muscled, with a voice that could carry across a battlefield. He had served in the French and Indian War as a teamster and had allegedly received 500 lashes from a British officer for punching him in the face. He liked to joke that the drummer miscounted and only gave him 499. So the British still owed him one. Morgan commanded a rifle corps around 500 men armed not with standard muskets, but with Pennsylvania long rifles. Also called Kentucky rifles, these weapons were technological marvels. Unlike the smoothbore muskets carried by most soldiers, rifles had grooves cut into the inside of the barrel that spun the bullet, making it fly straighter and farther. A good rifleman could hit a man-sized target at 300 yards. A musket was accurate to maybe 100 yards on a good day. The downside? Rifles were slower to load than muskets. You had to really force the bullet down that rifled barrel, and they couldn't mount bayonets. But Morgan's men were hunters and frontiersmen who had grown up with rifles in their hands. They knew how to fight from cover, how to pick targets, and how to disappear into the forest before the enemy could respond. They would become the terror of Burgoyne's army. Gates chose his position brilliantly, or rather, his Polish engineer chose it for him. Colonel Tadeusz Kosciuszko was a young military engineer from Poland who had come to America to fight for liberty. He understood fortifications, and he understood terrain. In early September, he selected a position called Bemis Heights, a series of bluffs overlooking the Hudson River. About 10 miles south of Saratoga village, it was perfect defensive ground. The heights commanded the river road that Burgoyne had to use. Any British attempt to push past would have to come uphill, into prepared positions, through difficult terrain. Kosciuszko designed a line of redoubts and earthworks that maximized the American advantages. The American army dug in and waited. By mid-September, Gates had about 7,000 men, a mix of Continental regulars and militia from New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. More arrived every day. Farmers left their fields, shopkeepers closed their businesses. The word was out, the British were coming. And this was where they would be stopped. Burgoyne, meanwhile, was in a bind. He couldn't go forward without a battle. He couldn't go back. His supplies were too low for a retreat through the devastated countryside. And Clinton, down in New York City, was too far away to help. On September 13th, Burgoyne's army crossed to the west side of the Hudson River on a pontoon bridge. They were now committed. There was no retreat. The stage was set. 2 armies, separated by a few miles of forest and farmland. One professional, disciplined, desperate. The other a mixture of regulars and amateurs, growing stronger by the day, fighting for their homes. The battle was about to begin. September 19th dawned clear and cool. Autumn was settling into upstate New York, the leaves just beginning to turn. Burgoyne held a council of war with his senior officers the night before. The situation was grim, and everyone knew it. His army was down to about 6,000 effective troops. Food was running desperately short. Men were on half rations, and even that couldn't last much longer. Intelligence suggested the Americans had at least as many men, possibly more, dug in on strong ground ahead. But Burgoyne had no choice. He couldn't sit still, he'd starve. He couldn't retreat. He'd already burned his bridge across the Hudson and didn't have the supplies. For a march back to Canada, the only way was forward. If he could break through the American lines, he could push on to Albany, and maybe Clinton would come up from New York to meet him. The plan Burgoyne settled on reflected both tactical sophistication and the limitations of 18th century warfare. He would divide his army into 3 columns and advance through the wilderness to strike the American left flank and center. The right wing, about 2,000 men under Brigadier General Simon Fraser, would swing wide to the west, moving through the forest to get around the American left. Fraser was arguably Burgoyne's best field commander, energetic, competent, respected by his men. The center column, about 1,100 men under Burgoyne's personal command with Brigadier General James Hamilton, would advance directly toward what Burgoyne believed was the American center. The left wing, about 1,100 German troops under Baron von Riedesel, would advance along the river road with the artillery and baggage train. This column would serve as a reserve and protect the British communications. The 3 columns would advance separately through the woods. Communication would be difficult, then converge on the American position in mid-afternoon. Coordination would depend on signal guns and messengers moving through dense forest. It was an ambitious plan in European warfare on open ground, with trained troops and clear sight lines. It might have worked beautifully in the American wilderness. We'll see. Gates's position at Bemis Heights was fundamentally defensive. His left flank rested on the Hudson River, secured by Kosciuszko's fortifications. His right flank extended into the woods to the west. But Benedict Arnold saw it differently. Arnold understood that if they sat passively in their fortifications and let Burgoyne probe and maneuver, the British might find a way around them. The forest to the west was thick, full of ravines and hills, but it was passable. If Fraser's column got around the American left unopposed, the whole position could be compromised. Arnold argued vehemently with Gates. They needed to advance to meet the British in the woods where British discipline and firepower would be nullified, where American woodcraft and marksmanship would matter most. Gates, cautious as always, was reluctant, but he finally agreed to send out a strong reconnaissance force. Arnold would command the American left wing 4 brigades, about 3,000 men. Morgan's riflemen would screen far in advance, serving as both scouts and skirmishers. It was around 12:30 in the afternoon when the battle began, and it began with Daniel Morgan's men doing exactly what they did best. Freeman's farm was a clearing of about 15 acres, carved out of the wilderness by a settler named Isaac Freeman. The cabin was abandoned. Now Freeman had left when the armies approached, but the open ground was still there. Fields of wheat and corn stubble, split-rail fences, and a few scattered trees. It sat roughly midway between the British starting positions and the American lines. Burgoyne's center column, struggling through the thick woods, emerged into this clearing around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. For the British soldiers, after hours of stumbling through the forest, the open ground must have seemed like a gift. Here they could see. Here they could form proper lines. Here they could fight the way they'd been trained. They had no idea what was about to hit them. Morgan's riflemen were screening ahead of the main American force, moving silently through the woods. They heard the British before they saw them. The jingle of equipment, officers calling orders, the tramp of hundreds of feet. Morgan used turkey calls to signal his men, a distinctive warbling whistle that carried through the forest. At his signal, around 1:15, the riflemen opened fire from the tree line surrounding Freeman's farm. The sound of rifle fire is different from musket fire, sharper, crisper. And suddenly British officers were falling, not randomly, but with precision. A lieutenant here, a captain there, a major clutching his throat. This wasn't the battlefield etiquette of European warfare, where gentlemen aimed at the massive enemy soldiers. This was targeted killing. The Americans were aiming for the men in fancy uniforms with sashes and epaulets. The ones giving orders, they were cutting the head off the British snake. The British regulars tried to respond, but they couldn't see their targets. The Americans were firing from behind trees, from the edge of the forest, then melting back into the shadows. A few riflemen were picked off when they got too bold or took too long to reload. But mostly they were ghosts in the forest, killing with impunity. For about 20 minutes, Burgoyne's center column was pinned in Freeman's farm, taking casualties, unable to advance or effectively respond. Officers screamed orders. Men fired blindly into the tree line. And still the rifle fire kept coming. Then Benedict Arnold arrived with the main American force, and the nature of the battle changed entirely. Arnold wasn't the type to sit back and direct traffic. When he heard the firing ahead, he spurred his horse forward, personally leading brigade after brigade of Continental infantry and militia out of the fortified lines and into the attack. Gates, back at headquarters, was apparently furious when he realized Arnold was committing so much of the army to an offensive action. This wasn't the plan, but Arnold wasn't at headquarters, and in the confusion and noise of battle, there wasn't much Gates could do about it. Arnold sent his brigades crashing into the British position in Freeman's farm like a hammer. Now it was regular infantry combat lines of men firing volleys at close range. The smoke so thick you could barely see, the noise deafening. The British soldiers were professionals. They held their ground, loaded and fired with mechanical precision, 3 shots a minute. But they were outnumbered now, taking casualties from both the massed volleys and the continuing sniper fire from the trees. And this is where the terrain made all the difference. Freeman's farm wasn't a nice flat European battlefield. It was broken ground. With fences and stumps and small rises, units got separated. British formations that depended on straight lines and mutual support found themselves fragmented. Individual companies fighting isolated actions. The battle became desperate, personal. Both sides loaded and fired as fast as they could. Men fell in windows. The wheat stubble grew slick with blood. Soldiers fought through the smoke with bayonets and rifle butts when there was no time to reload. One American officer later described it as one continuous peal of thunder. The sound of thousands of muskets and rifles firing in a confined space was physically stunning. Men's ears rang for days afterward. For the next 4 hours, from roughly 1:30 until 6 o'clock in the evening, Freeman's farm changed hands multiple times. The British would rally, fix bayonets, advance in good order. British bayonet charges were terrifying. Hundreds of men in red coats coming at you with 18 inches of steel on the ends of their muskets. Not firing, just coming on relentlessly. Many American militia units, less disciplined than Continental regulars, would break and run before the bayonets reached them. But then Morgan's riflemen, who had no bayonets and knew better than to face a British charge directly, would slip around the British flanks in the forest. They'd pour fire into the British from the sides and rear. The British advance would falter, and the Americans would come surging back. This pattern repeated over and over. The British would clear the field. The Americans would fight their way back. Neither side could achieve a decisive advantage. Both armies were feeding more and more troops into the meat grinder. Burgoyne committed his reserve infantry. Arnold kept bringing up fresh brigades. The casualty count climbed steadily. And here's where we need to talk about what made Morgan's riflemen so devastating. Because it was about more than just the range of their weapons. A Brown Bess musket, the standard British infantry weapon, was a smoothbore flintlock. The barrel had no rifling, so the bullet tumbled through the air unpredictably at 100 yards. You might hit a man-sized target if you were lucky. At 200 yards, you were basically throwing lead in someone's general direction. But the Brown Bess had advantages. It was quick to load 3 shots per minute for a well-trained soldier. It was reliable, and it could mount a bayonet, which was essential for close combat. The British doctrine was to get close to the enemy, fire massive volleys to break their formation, then charge with bayonets to finish the job. It worked brilliantly in Europe against enemies using the same tactics. The Pennsylvania long rifle was a completely different weapon. The barrel had spiral grooves cut inside rifling that made the bullet spin. A spinning bullet flies straight and true. A good rifleman could hit a man at 300 yards. A great rifleman could put 5 shots in a 6-inch circle at that range. The rifles were also longer and heavier than muskets, and most importantly, they were slow to load. The bullet had to be forced down that rifled barrel with a ramrod, and it took time, maybe 2 or 3 minutes per shot, and they couldn't mount bayonets. So Morgan trained his men to fight differently. They never stood in the open and traded volleys. They worked in pairs or small groups. One man would shoot while his partner covered him. Then they both disappear back into cover while reloading. They picked high-value targets: officers, sergeants, anyone who looked like they were organizing the British troops. And they used the terrain in the forests around Freeman's farm, with its trees and ravines and broken ground. Morgan's men could get close enough to use their rifles effectively, then vanish before the British could respond. British officers later described the experience as psychologically crushing. You couldn't see your enemy. You couldn't charge them. You just stood there while your best men dropped, one by one, shot by an invisible foe. It was like fighting shadows. Around 4 in the afternoon, things got worse for the Americans. Brigadier General Simon Fraser's column, which had been swinging wide to the west, finally arrived on the battlefield. Fraser was a Scottish professional soldier, 48 years old, with decades of experience. He led the British Light Infantry and Grenadiers, the elite troops of Burgoyne's army, and he arrived on the American left flank at exactly the right moment to turn the tide. Fraser's troops came crashing through the woods and hit the American left like a sledgehammer. Suddenly, the Americans, who had been pressing hard against Burgoyne's center, found themselves fighting on 2 fronts. Units that had been advancing were now in danger of being surrounded. Arnold rode through the chaos, trying to shore up the line. He sent brigade after brigade to face Fraser's fresh troops. The fighting reached a new level of intensity. But Fraser's men, for all their training and courage, ran into the same problem everyone else did: Morgan's riflemen. As Fraser tried to organize his attack, riflemen in the woods started picking off his officers. Fraser himself became a target, though he wasn't hit today. That would come later, in the second battle. Meanwhile, Baron von Riedesel's German troops were supposed to be advancing up the river road, securing Burgoyne's left and serving as a reserve. But the forest terrain was even worse along the river, and they were moving slowly. Around 6 o'clock, with the battle at Freeman's farm locked in a desperate stalemate and British casualties mounting, Burgoyne sent urgent messages to Riedesel. "Come now, come with everything you have." Riedesel responded immediately. He left a small force to guard the baggage train and marched with his main body directly toward the sound of the guns. His troops arrived at Freeman's farm just before sunset. The German soldiers were fresh, organized, and they brought artillery, several of the cannon that had been with the baggage train. Riedesel deployed his guns on the British left and opened fire with canister, essentially giant shotgun shells filled with dozens of musket balls. At close range, canister turned artillery pieces into horrific killing machines. The American troops, exhausted after hours of fighting, couldn't stand against fresh enemy battalions and artillery fire. They fell back, grudgingly, fighting for every yard. But by now, night was falling. In the 17th century warfare, you didn't fight night battles. It was too easy for everything to dissolve into chaos, for units to fire on their own men in the darkness. As twilight deepened, an unspoken agreement took hold. The firing died down. Men stopped advancing. The battle ended. The British held Freeman's farm. By the technical standards of 18th century warfare, that made them the victors. You won if you held the ground when the fighting stopped. But Burgoyne knew better. His army had suffered brutal casualties. About 600 men killed, wounded, or missing out of 3,000 engaged. That was a 20% casualty rate in a single afternoon. Among officers, the percentage was even worse. British leaders had been targeted relentlessly by American riflemen, and they'd paid for it. The Americans suffered around 300 casualties out of about 3,000 engaged, a much lower rate, and crucially, they could afford it better every day. More militia arrived at Gates's camp. Burgoyne's numbers only went down. Worse, from Burgoyne's perspective, he'd achieved nothing. He'd forced the Americans to retreat a few hundred yards. That was it. The American fortified line at Bemis Heights was still intact, still blocking his path to Albany. He was no closer to his goal than he'd been that morning. And he'd learned something disturbing. His army couldn't fight effectively in this terrain. The woods and broken ground nullified his advantages in discipline and bayonet charges. The American riflemen had terrorized his officers, His soldiers, bred on European battlefields, were out of their element. That night, in his tent, Burgoyne faced a grim decision. Retreat was probably the smart move. Fall back to Fort Ticonderoga, regroup, try again next year with better planning and coordination. But retreat would be seen as defeat. It would be a humiliation. And Burgoyne's pride, his sense of honor, his whole self-image as a dashing military hero, all of it rebelled against the idea of retreat. So he made the decision that would doom him. He would wait. He would rest his army, bring up more supplies, and try again. Surely Clinton would come north from New York. Surely Howe would realize his mistake and send reinforcements. Surely something would change. It was a gamble. And in the forests of upstate New York, with his army shrinking daily and his enemies growing stronger, John Burgoyne had just bet everything on a very long shot. The Americans, for their part, were euphoric. They'd faced the British army in open combat and driven them back. The professional redcoats had bled and died like anyone else. The myth of British invincibility was shattered. Benedict Arnold was riding high. He'd led from the front, exposed himself to fire repeatedly, and his men worshipped him for it. This was his finest hour. His men worshipped him for it. This was his finest hour. But Arnold and Gates were about to have a falling out that would poison their relationship and create one of the strangest ironies in American history. We'll get to that. For now, the army settled into an uneasy stalemate. Burgoyne's forces dug in at Freeman's farm and waited. The Americans strengthened their lines and watched. More militia arrived every day. The trees turned red and gold as September wore on. And in 17 more days, they would fight again. September 20th dawned on two exhausted armies, separated by less than a mile of contested ground. The wounded cried out from both sides. Burial parties worked through the morning, digging graves for the dead. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, mixed now with the metallic scent of blood and the first hints of decay. For Burgoyne, the next 2.5 weeks would be a slow-motion nightmare. His army was running out of food, desperately, critically running out. The soldiers had been on half rations since mid-September. Now Burgoyne cut rations further. By early October, men would be surviving on barely a third of normal portions. The horses had it worse. They were starving, dozens dying every day, and without horses, you couldn't move artillery or supply wagons. The American strategy was simple and brutally effective. Squeeze. They didn't attack Burgoyne's main position. They didn't need to. Instead, militia parties roamed through the countryside, cutting Burgoyne's supply line back to Canada. Any British foraging party that ventured too far from camp was ambushed. Any messenger trying to carry dispatches was intercepted. Burgoyne sent increasingly desperate messages to Clinton in New York City. "I need help. I need supplies. I need reinforcements. Can you come north?" Clinton's replies, when they came at all, were non-committal. He didn't have enough troops to launch a major offensive. Howe had taken the bulk of the army to Philadelphia. Clinton was stuck playing defense in New York, watching the Americans, worried about his own position. But Burgoyne clung to hope. Clinton said he would try to make a diversion. Maybe in early October. Maybe that would be enough, maybe. Meanwhile, the American army grew stronger every day. This is crucial to understanding Saratoga. The longer the stalemate lasted, the more the balance shifted in favor of the Americans. Farmers from New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, even Connecticut men who hadn't joined the Continental Army, but who would fight to defend their homes, grabbed their muskets and marched to Gates's camp. Some came organized in militia companies. Others came as individuals or small groups, but they came. By early October, Gates had somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 men. The numbers are imprecise because militia units came and went, but the trend was clear. Burgoyne was outnumbered more than 2-1, and the gap widened every day. While Burgoyne slowly starved, an equally destructive drama was playing out in the American camp. Horatio Gates was writing his official report of the Battle of Freeman's Farm to send to Congress and George Washington, and in that report, he didn't mention Benedict Arnold even once. Not once Arnold, who had led the American attack. who had personally commanded thousands of men in combat, who had been in the thick of the fighting for 5 hours. Gates wrote him out of the story entirely. Why? Ego, jealousy, professional rivalry. Gates wanted the credit for the victory. He knew Arnold's aggressive tactics had been key to American success, but he couldn't admit it. Admitting it would undermine his own claim to glory. When Arnold found out, he was furious. This was his worst nightmare realized. Once again, a senior officer taking credit for Arnold's battlefield success. Once again, Arnold being treated as if he didn't matter. Arnold stormed into Gates's headquarters and confronted him. Witnesses said Arnold was practically incoherent with rage. Gates, cold and bureaucratic, essentially told Arnold that he was subordinate and needed to follow orders or get out. Arnold, never one to back down from a fight, shot back with recriminations. He accused Gates of cowardice, of sitting safely in headquarters while other men did the fighting. Gates responded by stripping Arnold of his command, the troops. Arnold had led at Freeman's farm would now report directly to Gates. It was a spectacular falling out. Arnold, technically still part of the army but with no official duties, spent the next 2 weeks pacing around camp like a caged animal. He wrote letters to Gates demanding a pass to leave. Gates ignored him. Arnold wrote to George Washington, demanding satisfaction. Washington, dealing with his own problems in Pennsylvania, didn't respond quickly. Arnold was stuck in camp, officially sidelined, seething with resentment, and watching Burgoyne's army grow weaker every day. He wanted action. He wanted redemption. He wanted glory. He would get his chance, but not the way anyone expected. One of Burgoyne's biggest strategic miscalculations was his assumption about loyalist support. He genuinely believed that most Americans were secretly loyal to the crown, intimidated into silence by rebel agitators. Once a British army appeared to protect them, he thought, thousands of loyalists would rally to the colors. It didn't happen. A few hundred did join him, mostly in the early stages of the campaign, when British victory seemed assured. But as Burgoyne's situation deteriorated, the trickle of loyalist recruits dried up completely. The Americans, meanwhile, were fighting on their home ground. Every farm, every village, every crossroads, they knew the terrain intimately. Local militiamen could appear, ambush a British patrol, then fade back into the community. How do you fight an enemy when you can't distinguish between hostile militia and neutral farmers? Burgoyne couldn't. His army became increasingly isolated, surrounded by a hostile population. Every day brought more reports of ambushes, missing pickets, supply wagons captured. And the Native American allies? They were long gone after the Jane McCrae incident destroyed their reputation. And as it became clear, Burgoyne wasn't winning. The native warriors from the Iroquois Confederacy quietly packed up and went home. They'd been promised plunder and victory. Instead, they'd found hard fighting and growing American power not worth it. By early October, Burgoyne's army was essentially alone in enemy territory, shrinking, starving, and surrounded. On October 3rd, Sir Henry Clinton finally made his move from New York City. He loaded 3,000 troops onto ships and sailed north up the Hudson River. On October 6th, his forces captured 2 small American forts, Fort Montgomery and Fort Clinton, in the Hudson Highlands, about 40 miles south of Albany. It was a competent operation, and it did divert some American attention. But Clinton didn't push further north. He didn't have enough troops for a serious advance. He'd made his diversion, bloodied the Americans a bit, and that was it. For Burgoyne, waiting desperately for news, this was simultaneously hopeful and devastating. Clinton was coming. But not soon enough, not strong enough, not close enough. Burgoyne's officers urged him to retreat while there was still time. Baron von Riedesel, in particular, begged him to fall back toward Canada. Every day they stayed and they'd retreat harder. The Americans were building up forces to the north too, cutting off that route. Soon they'd be completely surrounded. But Burgoyne couldn't bring himself to order a retreat. Partly pride, partly a real concern that retreating through hostile territory with a starving, demoralized army would turn into a catastrophe, and partly sheer stubborn hope that something would change. On October 4th, Burgoyne held a council of war with his senior officers. The meeting was tense. Everyone knew the situation was desperate. Burgoyne proposed one more attack, one more attempt to break through the American lines. If they could achieve a breakthrough, they could still reach Albany. From Albany, maybe they could link up with Clinton, maybe. Some officers supported him, others thought it was madness, but in the end, the army was running so low on supplies that doing nothing wasn't really an option either. If they stayed put, they'd starve in camp. If they retreated, they'd starve on the road. So they would attack one more time. October 7th was set as the date. But this wouldn't be a full-scale assault. Burgoyne didn't have the strength for that anymore. Instead, it would be a reconnaissance in force. Roughly 1,500 men and 8 cannon would probe the American left, looking for a weak spot or an opportunity to outflank the American position. It was a half measure, born of desperation and wishful thinking, and it would lead to Burgoyne's destruction. For the rank-and-file soldiers on both sides, the 18 days between battles were a strange mixture of boredom, tension, and suffering. British and German soldiers sat in their camps, hungry, cold at night as October temperatures dropped, wondering what would happen to them. Desertion increased. Men would slip away in the night, trying to disappear into the countryside. Some were caught and hanged as examples. Others vanished successfully. Though what happened to them, whether they were killed by militia, or captured, or managed somehow to make their way to safety, no one knows. Baroness von Riedesel, the wife of the German commander, was in camp with her 3 small children. She'd followed her husband on campaign, as was sometimes done by officers' wives in that era. Her diary from these days is heartbreaking, describing the fear, the hunger, the sound of rifle fire echoing through the camp every night as American sharpshooters harassed the British pickets. She wrote about cooking meals over tiny fires, trying to keep her children calm, listening to the wounded cry out from the field hospital. She'd know about the chaos and terror of war from a perspective rarely recorded, that of a non-combatant trapped in the middle of it. On the American side, confidence was growing. New militia arrived constantly. Supplies flowed in from the surrounding countryside, not abundantly, but adequately. Men could see that they were winning. The mighty British army was trapped, weakening, and there was nothing Burgoyne could do about it. Daniel Morgan's riflemen kept up a constant harassment. At night, they'd creep close to British lines and fire into the camps, aiming at sentries and anyone near a fire. They'd make sure Burgoyne's men got no rest, no peace. The psychological impact was immense. And Benedict Arnold? He was the talk of the camp. Everyone knew about his blow-up with Gates. Officers debated whose side they were on. Soldiers, for the most part, sided with Arnold. He'd led them in battle, bled with them, and they respected that. Gates, safely in his headquarters, seemed less heroic by comparison. But Arnold had no command. He could only pace and fume and wait. His chance would come on October 7th, in the strangest and most dramatic way possible. The stage was set. 2 armies, one desperate and one confident, were about to collide again. And this time, there would be no stalemate. This time, one side would break completely. October 7th, 1777, the day everything changed. The morning of October 7th was cool and overcast. Around 10 o'clock, Burgoyne assembled his reconnaissance force. About 1,500 infantry, 8 cannon, several hundred loyalists and Canadian militia. His best remaining troops. The plan, such as it was to march west from the British camp toward the American left, looking for a weak point or an opportunity to outflank Gates's position. If they found one, perhaps they could exploit it. If not, well, Burgoyne hadn't really thought that far ahead. Brigadier General Simon Fraser commanded the advance. With him rode British grenadiers, light infantry, and German troops under Baron von Riedesel. They moved slowly through the autumn woods, cannon crews struggling to maneuver their guns over rough ground. By around noon, the British column emerged into another cleared area, a wheat field owned by a local farmer named Barber. It was about 3/4 of a mile northwest of Freeman's farm, where the first battle had been fought. The open ground was roughly 400 yards wide, bounded by woods on all sides. Fraser deployed his troops in a line across the wheat field and sent out scouts to probe deeper into the woods to the west. The 8 cannon were positioned to cover the field, and then they waited. This is where Burgoyne's half-hearted planning became obvious. Was this a reconnaissance? An attack? A defensive position? Nobody seemed quite sure. The troops just stood there in the wheat field, a line of redcoats and blue German uniforms, an obvious target visible for miles. And the Americans saw them immediately. American pickets spotted the British deployment within minutes and raced back to Gates's headquarters with the news. Gates called his officers together. What to do? This time, Gates made an aggressive decision, possibly influenced by the criticism he'd received for being too cautious at Freeman's farm. He would attack and attack hard, with multiple columns simultaneously hitting different parts of the British line. Daniel Morgan's riflemen and light infantry would swing far to the west, circle through the woods, and hit the British right flank Fraser's position. General Enoch Poor's brigade would attack the British left. General Ebenezer Learned's brigade would support and hit the center. It was a sophisticated plan, requiring coordination through difficult terrain. Gates was betting that his officers could execute it independently because once the fighting started, central control would be impossible. And then there was Benedict Arnold. Arnold had no command. He'd been stripped of his duties. Technically, he wasn't even supposed to be part of the attack, but as the orders went out and troops started marching, Arnold couldn't stand it. He could hear drums beating, bugles calling, men marching past his tent. The battle was starting, and he was being left behind. What happened next became legend. Arnold, according to multiple witnesses, seemed to go mad, though whether it was actual madness or brilliant battlefield instinct is debatable. He leaped on his horse, a large brown mare, and without orders, without permission, galloped out of camp toward the sound of the guns. Gates saw him go and sent an aide galloping after him with orders to return. But Arnold was already gone, riding hard, and he had no intention of coming back. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Morgan's riflemen emerged from the woods on the British right flank. They'd made a wide circle, moving silently through the forest, and now they were in position. The riflemen opened fire with devastating effect. British and German soldiers began falling before they even saw their attackers. And then Morgan's men melted back into the trees, reloading as they moved. Brigadier General Simon Fraser immediately recognized the danger. If his right flank collapsed, the entire British line would be rolled up. He rode forward, trying to rally his troops, calling orders, pointing with his sword, organizing a defensive formation. Fraser was an obvious target, a senior officer on horseback, wearing a distinctive uniform with gold epaulettes and a bright red sash. Every American rifleman in range saw him. Daniel Morgan, watching from the woods with his characteristic turkey call whistle around his neck, pointed Fraser out to his best marksman. The accounts vary on exactly who fired the fatal shot. Some say it was Timothy Murphy, a legendary sharpshooter from Pennsylvania. Others credit different riflemen. What's certain is that several riflemen began targeting Fraser specifically. Fraser moved constantly, riding back and forth along his line. The first shot missed, the second missed. Fraser's aide begged him to pull back. Out of range, Fraser refused. His men needed to see him, needed his leadership. Then a rifle cracked, and Fraser jerked in his saddle. The bullet had struck him in the abdomen. He managed to stay on his horse for a few moments before his aide caught him as he fell. They carried Fraser to the rear, to the field hospital. He would die that night after 8 hours of agony. But the effect on British morale was immediate. The British right flank began to crumble, without Fraser's steadying presence. Without clear leadership, units started pulling back into the woods. Morgan's riflemen pressed forward, firing from cover. And now General Poor's brigade was hitting the British left simultaneously. The British line was collapsing at both ends. And then Benedict Arnold came thundering onto the battlefield like something out of mythology. Multiple witnesses described Arnold that afternoon as either possessed or inspired, perhaps both. He rode straight into the heaviest fighting. seemingly oblivious to danger, rallying American troops wherever he went. Men who saw him said his eyes were wild, his voice hoarse from shouting, and his horse was covered in foam from hard riding. Arnold had no official command, but soldiers knew who he was. When he shouted orders, they obeyed. When he pointed toward the enemy, they advanced. His mere presence electrified the American attack. He rode first to Poor's brigade on the American right, attacking the British left. The fighting there was brutal massed volleys at close range, units advancing and falling back through thick smoke. Arnold rode directly into it, shouting encouragement, directing units into gaps in the British line. Then he wheeled his horse and galloped across the entire battlefield, across open ground under heavy fire, to join Morgan's attack on the British right. Men watched in awe as Arnold seemed to simply ignore the bullets and cannonballs. His hat was shot off. His coat was torn by a musket ball. He didn't slow down. Gates's aide finally caught up to Arnold and delivered Gates's order to return to camp. Arnold apparently laughed in the man's face and rode away, deeper into the battle. Around 3 o'clock, the British line in the wheat field broke completely. Burgoyne's reconnaissance force was in full retreat, streaming back toward their fortified camp near Freeman's farm. American troops pursued, but the British fell back to prepared positions, a series of redoubts, small log and earth, fortifications that protected their main camp. For most commanders, this would have been enough. The British were beaten, driven back, suffering heavy casualties. The Americans could have declared victory and pulled back to their own lines. But Arnold wasn't finished, and what he did next would decide the battle. The British camp was protected by a series of redoubts and breastworks. Basically, a line of small forts connected by trenches and earthworks. These fortifications had been built over the past 2 weeks, designed to protect Burgoyne's army from exactly the kind of attack that was now happening. On the British right, the strongest point was Balcarres Redoubt, named for the Earl of Balcarres who commanded there. It was a substantial fortification with log walls, firing positions, and cannon. It anchored the British right flank. On the left, protecting the British supply lines and hospital area, was Bremen Redoubt, held by German troops under Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Bremen. It was smaller than Balcarres, but still formidable, with a garrison of about 200 men. Between these two strong points were connecting trenches and earthworks, also defended by British and German troops. Arnold looked at this defensive line and apparently decided that taking one of these forts was the key to breaking Burgoyne completely, not pushing the British back, destroying them. Around 4 o'clock, Arnold led an assault on Balcarres Redoubt. He gathered several American regiments that were pursuing the retreating British and pointed them at the fort. The Americans advanced in the face of heavy fire. Cannon loaded with canister, essentially huge shotgun shells, ripped through their ranks. Musket fire from the log walls cut down men with every volley, but they kept coming. Arnold at the front, waving his sword, shouting. But Balcarres held. The British defenders, fighting for their lives, poured devastating fire down onto the attackers. The Americans couldn't get a foothold after brutal minutes of close combat. The assault stalled and then broke. Men fell back from the walls, dragging wounded with them. Arnold, frustrated but undeterred, looked for another target, and he found one. The German-held fort on the British left, Bremen Redoubt, was slightly less formidable than Balcarres, and critically, Arnold noticed that there was a gap in the British defenses between Bremen Redoubt and the next fortification to its left. If American troops could exploit that gap and get behind Bremen, they could take the fort from the rear. Arnold wheeled his exhausted horse and galloped toward the American units fighting on that part of the field. He gathered up parts of 2 bridesmen from Connecticut and New Hampshire and led them toward the gap he'd spotted. The Germans in Bremen Redoubt saw them coming and opened fire. Arnold's horse went down, shot through the neck. Arnold leaped clear, grabbed another horse from a nearby officer, and kept going. The American troops, inspired by Arnold's fearlessness, poured through the gap. Some units hit the redoubt from the side. Others, incredibly, got completely around it and attacked from the rear. The Germans, suddenly fighting on 3 sides, fell back in confusion. Arnold rode right up to the walls of Bremen Redoubt. Still at the front of the attack, American soldiers swarmed over the defenses. Lieutenant Colonel Bremen, trying to rally his men, was shot dead. The Germans, leaderless and overwhelmed, began to surrender. And then Arnold was hit. A German soldier, one of the last defenders, fired his musket at close range. The bullet struck Arnold's left leg, the same leg that had been wounded at the Battle of Quebec back in 1775. Arnold crashed to the ground, his horse falling on top of him, pinning him. American soldiers rushed forward, drove off the remaining German defenders, and pulled Arnold free. He was screaming not in fear, but in rage, "Don't carry me off the field." He shouted, "Let me die here." He'd been hit in the leg, not mortally, but he didn't know that in the moment. Officers convinced him that he needed medical attention. They rigged a litter and carried him off the field. Arnold kept trying to give orders, pointing back at the battle, until the pain became too much and he passed out. The battle was effectively over. With Bremen Redoubt in American hands, Burgoyne's left flank was completely compromised. American troops now had a clear path to attack the British camp, hospital, and supply wagons from the rear. As darkness fell, it was after 6 o'clock now. The sun setting early in October, Burgoyne ordered a withdrawal. His army abandoned Freeman's farm and the entire line of fortifications, pulling back to a new position closer to the river. It was a desperate, disorganized retreat. Men stumbled through the darkness, carrying wounded, dragging cannon, trying not to get separated from their units. American rifle fire harassed them the entire way. By midnight, what was left of Burgoyne's army was huddled in a new defensive position near the river. About a mile north of where they'd started the day, they'd lost their fortifications, their supplies were low, and they'd suffered devastating casualties. Another 600 men killed, wounded, or captured on top of the losses from Freeman's farm. Just as critically, they'd lost morale. The professional soldiers of the British Army had been beaten badly by American farmers and militia. The myth of British invincibility was shattered completely now. Men looked at each other in the darkness and wondered, "Is this it? Are we finished?" Burgoyne called another council of war. His officers, haggard and exhausted, gathered in his tent. The question wasn't whether to attack anymore. That was clearly impossible. The question was whether they could retreat or whether they were already trapped. Baron von Riedesel argued strongly for immediate retreat while darkness provided some cover. Every hour they delayed, he said, the trap would close tighter. By morning, the Americans would have forces north of them, cutting off their route to Canada. Burgoyne was finally convinced. They would retreat immediately, through the night. Leave the wounded who couldn't be moved, leave most of the baggage. Just get the army out before it was too late. But it was already too late. They just didn't know it yet. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the savage irony of October 7th, 1777. Benedict Arnold, fighting without orders, defying his commanding officer, had effectively won the Battle of Saratoga for the Americans. His courage, his tactical brilliance, his ability to inspire men in the chaos of combat, all of it had turned what might have been a moderate American victory into a crushing defeat for Burgoyne. Arnold's leg was shattered. The bullet had hit the femur, and in the 18th century, such wounds often led to amputation or death from infection. Arnold would survive, but he'd spend months recovering, and he'd walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He'd saved his country, and in 3 years he would betray it. In 1780, Arnold would attempt to hand over the fortress of West Point to the British. He'd negotiate secretly with British officers, plotting to give them the key to the Hudson River in exchange for money and a commission in the British Army. When the plot was discovered, Arnold would flee to British lines and spend the rest of the war fighting against his countrymen. Why did he do it? Historians debate endlessly. Bitterness over lack of recognition, financial problems. His marriage to a loyalist woman? Some combination of all three? Whatever the reasons, the man who was the hero of Saratoga would become America's most infamous traitor. At Saratoga battlefield today, there's a monument to Arnold's contribution, but it doesn't bear his name. It's known as the Boot Monument, commemorating the leg that was wounded on October 7, 1777. Americans will honor his leg, but not the man. On October 7th, though, Arnold was simply a hero, lying in the field hospital with a shattered leg, probably wondering if he'd survive the night. And outside, Burgoyne's army was beginning its final death march. October 8th, Burgoyne's army began its retreat north just before dawn. They moved slowly, painfully, hampered by wounded men, by the few remaining supply wagons they refused to abandon, by exhaustion and despair. They made it about 8 miles before American forces blocked the road ahead. Remember, Gates now had somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 men. Morgan's riflemen and various militia units had spent the night marching north, racing to cut off the British line of retreat. By mid-morning on October 8th, Burgoyne found American troops dug in across the road ahead of him. He tried to swing east toward the Hudson River, looking for another route north. More Americans appeared. He tried to break through. Rifle fire from the woods drove his advance guard back. Slowly, inexorably, the trap closed. By October 9th. Burgoyne's army was completely surrounded. To the south, Gates's main force. To the north, militia blocking retreat. To the east, the Hudson River. To the west, more militia in the forested hills. 30,000 Americans, if you counted every militiaman who showed up once. Word spread that Burgoyne was trapped surrounding 6,000 British and German soldiers. For the next week, Burgoyne's army sat in place while the situation deteriorated from bad to catastrophic. Food ran out completely. Men were eating their horses. Some were eating roots and bark. The wounded, lying in field hospitals with no medicine and minimal care, cried out day and night. Baroness von Riedesel, still with the army along with her children, wrote in her diary about huddling in a cellar while American cannon fire crashed overhead, about the smell of death and gangrene, about trying to keep her children calm while the world fell apart around them. Every night, American riflemen crept close to the British lines and fired into the camps. Not organized volleys, just individual shots, targeting anyone near a fire, anyone who looked like an officer, anyone who showed themselves. The psychological warfare was effective. British and German soldiers couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, couldn't escape the constant threat. Desertion became epidemic. Men simply walked away in the night, trying to surrender to American lines rather than starve with their units. Some made it. Others were shot by their own sentries or caught by American patrols. Burgoyne sent more desperate messages to Clinton. No response. Clinton's little expedition up the Hudson had stalled. He wasn't coming. Nobody was coming. On October 12th, Burgoyne called yet another council of war. The question was no longer whether to surrender, but when and on what terms. Some officers argued for trying to break out, to fight their way north through the American lines. It would be bloody. They'd have to abandon the wounded. But maybe some of the army could escape. Others argued this was suicide. The Americans outnumbered them 4 or 5 to 1. Any breakout attempt would turn into a massacre. Baron von Riedesel proposed surrender, but on honorable terms. In European warfare, there was an established tradition of surrender with honors. A defeated army would lay down its arms, but would be treated as honorable prisoners of war. Not criminals. Officers could keep their swords. Sometimes armies were even allowed to march home on parole, promising not to fight again. Could they negotiate such terms with the Americans? Burgoyne, finally facing reality, authorized negotiations on October 13th. He sent a message to Gates under a flag of truce, proposing a meeting to discuss terms. The negotiations were fascinating, a window into the military culture of the 18th century and the competing pressures both commanders faced. Burgoyne wanted to avoid the term surrender entirely. That was too humiliating. Instead, he proposed a convention, a mutual agreement between honorable opponents. His troops wouldn't surrender. They'd agree to lay down arms on condition that they be allowed to march to Boston, board ships, and return to Britain, never to serve in North America again. Gates was inclined to accept. Why not? Getting 5,000 British and German troops out of North America without further bloodshed seemed like a good deal. And Gates, ever mindful of his reputation, wanted to cement his status as the victor of Saratoga. Grinding Burgoyne into the dirt might produce more casualties and could make Gates look brutal rather than magnanimous. But there was another factor. Gates knew that large American reinforcements were marching toward Saratoga. Some were already arriving. If he waited a few more days, he'd have overwhelming force and could demand unconditional surrender, total humiliation for Burgoyne. However, there was also a risk. Gates had received reports that Clinton was finally advancing up the Hudson with reinforcements. What if Clinton actually broke through? What if this was Gates's only chance to secure Burgoyne's surrender before the situation changed? Gates decided to accept Burgoyne's proposed terms with some modifications. The agreement, signed on October 15th and known as the Convention of Saratoga, stipulated Burgoyne's army would march out with full military honors, colors flying, drums beating. They would stack their arms in a public ceremony, symbolically laying down their weapons, but doing so as soldiers, not prisoners. Officers could keep their swords and personal property. The entire army would march to Boston and board ships for Britain, on the explicit condition that they would not serve again in the American War. It was, by 18th century standards, an incredibly generous agreement. Burgoyne, a few days from total disaster, had managed to negotiate terms that preserved his army's honor. But there was a catch, and Burgoyne knew it. Would Congress honor Gates's agreement? Gates didn't have the authority to negotiate treaties. Congress could and eventually would reject the convention and hold Burgoyne's troops as prisoners of war for the duration of the conflict. But that was a problem for later. For now, both sides prepared for the surrender ceremony. The morning of October 17th was cold and clear, autumn in upstate New York. The leaves brilliant red and gold, the air sharp with the promise of winter. The surrender ceremony was held in an open field near the town of Saratoga. The American army formed two lines, stretching for nearly a mile, creating a corridor for the British and Germans to march through. Horatio Gates deliberately kept the proceedings low-key. He ordered his men to stand at attention silently, no cheering, no insults, treating the defeated enemy with respect. It was good tactics. Humiliating a defeated enemy makes future surrenders less likely, but it was also genuinely noble. The British and German troops assembled in their camps for the last time. Officers called roll. Sergeants straightened ranks. Men put on their best remaining uniforms, trying to maintain some dignity. Then, around 10 o'clock in the morning, they began to march. Music first, British military bands playing solemn marchers. Then the flags, the regimental colors that represented each unit's identity and history. Then the soldiers themselves, marching in formation, muskets on their shoulders, trying to look like professional soldiers rather than the defeated, starving, broken men they actually were. 5,791 men, British redcoats in their distinctive uniforms, German soldiers in blue and green, a few loyalists and Canadians, all marching between two lines of American militia and Continental soldiers, many of whom wore homespun hunting shirts rather than proper uniforms, who'd been farmers and shopkeepers a few weeks ago. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The greatest empire on earth, defeated by amateurs. As the British and Germans reached the designated spot, they halted, officers gave commands, and then, regiment by regiment, the soldiers stacked their muskets in neat pyramids on the ground. Some men cried, some looked angry, some just looked exhausted and relieved it was over. A few soldiers deliberately broke their muskets before stacking them, a final gesture of defiance, refusing to give the Americans functioning weapons. The ceremony took several hours. Finally, it was done. Burgoyne and his senior officers rode forward to meet Gates. There are several accounts of this meeting, with varying details, but the essence is clear. Burgoyne was formal, dignified, trying to maintain his reputation even in defeat. He reportedly said to Gates, "The fortune of war has made me your prisoner. Gates replied graciously, acknowledging Burgoyne's bravery and the difficulty of the campaign. He invited Burgoyne to dinner that evening, a gesture of respect between officers. That dinner, held in Gates's headquarters tent, must have been surreal. British, German, and American officers eating together, making polite conversation, as if they hadn't been trying to kill each other a week earlier. The rules of warfare in the 18th century allowed for such moments once the fighting stopped. Honor required treating one's enemy with courtesy. But beneath the civility, everyone knew what this meant. News of Saratoga took weeks to spread, but when it did, the shockwaves were felt around the globe. In Britain, the reaction was catastrophic for the government. Lord North, the Prime Minister, reportedly paced his office for hours after receiving the news. Muttering that it was all over, King George refused to accept defeat and demanded the war continue. But politically, Saratoga was devastating. A whole British army had surrendered to the rebels. The strategy of dividing the colonies had failed completely, and it became clear that this wasn't going to be a short war to suppress a rebellion. This was going to be a long, expensive, potentially unwinnable conflict. The political opposition in Parliament used Saratoga to hammer the government. How could you lose an entire army to untrained colonials? What incompetence led to Burgoyne being stranded without support? Heads should roll figuratively for now, though some politicians did lose their positions. But the real impact was in France. Benjamin Franklin was 71 years old in 1777. And he was in Paris on the most important diplomatic mission of his life. Congress had sent Franklin to France back in late 1776 with one goal: convince the French to enter the war on America's side. France was still smarting from its defeat in the 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in North America, where they'd lost Canada and much of their American empire to Britain. The French government, led by King Louis XVI and his foreign minister, Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, wanted to hurt Britain, but they didn't want to back a losing cause. Franklin had been working the French court for months, and he was good at it. He played the role of the simple American philosopher, wore plain clothes, no wig, acted like the rustic sage from the wilderness. The French aristocracy ate it up. Franklin was feted at salons. Ladies wore their hair à la Franklin, and he became something of a celebrity. But being popular and getting military alliance were different things. Vergennes wanted proof that the Americans could actually win before France committed. Saratoga was that proof. News of Burgoyne's surrender reached Paris in early December 1777. Franklin received the dispatches and immediately went to Vergennes. Now, he argued, now is the time. The Americans have proven they can defeat British regular forces in conventional warfare. If France joins now, Britain can be beaten. Vergennes was convinced. He'd been leaning toward intervention anyway, and Saratoga tipped the scales. Detailed negotiations began immediately. On February 6, 1778, less than 4 months after Saratoga, France and the United States signed the Treaty of Alliance. It was everything Franklin had hoped for. France formally recognized American independence. France pledged military and financial support. Most critically, France committed to fight until American independence was secured. No separate peace with Britain. In June of 1778, France officially declared war on Britain. And suddenly, Britain's problem multiplied exponentially. This wasn't just a colonial rebellion anymore. This was a global war against a major European power. French money, weapons, and military advisors began flowing to America. French naval forces started contesting British control of the seas. French military engineers, like the Marquis de Lafayette and the Comte de Rochambeau, arrived with professional troops. And in 1781, it would be the French fleet blocking Chesapeake Bay that made possible the Siege of Yorktown and the final decisive American victory. Without Saratoga, there's no French alliance. Without the French alliance, American independence is vastly harder, maybe impossible. This is why Saratoga is called the turning point of the American Revolution. But France wasn't done. Spain, seeing France at war with Britain, saw an opportunity. Spain declared war on Britain in 1779, hoping to reclaim Gibraltar and other territories. The Netherlands, a major trading power, also ended up at war with Britain in 1780, primarily over trade issues, but tied to the broader conflict. Resources that would have gone to crushing the American rebellion were diverted elsewhere. British strategy in North America became more cautious, more defensive. The initiative had shifted permanently. And it all started at Saratoga. Looking back, what made Saratoga a decisive American victory? Because it wasn't preordained. Burgoyne's army was professional, well-equipped and experienced. The Americans were outnumbered at first and less trained. Several factors came together. First, terrain and logistics. European armies were built for European warfare. Open fields, established roads, supply bases. The American wilderness nullified those advantages. Burgoyne's supply lines stretched too far, through hostile territory. Every mile he advanced, he got weaker. Second, the rifle and irregular warfare. Morgan's riflemen introduced a new kind of combat that European armies weren't prepared for. Targeted killing of officers, fighting from cover. Hit-and-run tactics. It was psychologically devastating and tactically effective. Third, American persistence. The militia kept showing up. After Freeman's farm, a defeat in traditional terms, the Americans didn't disperse or lose heart. They dug in and got stronger. That resilience, that refusal to accept defeat, changed everything. Fourth, British strategic failure. The complete lack of coordination between Burgoyne, Howe, and Clinton meant the three-pronged strategy collapsed before it began. Burgoyne marched into a trap that his own side had partially created. And fifth, leadership, though not always from the top. Gates was competent but cautious. Arnold and Morgan, operating semi-independently, provided the aggressive battlefield leadership that won the actual fights. Sometimes victory comes from subordinates doing the right thing, despite their commanders. What happened to the main characters of this drama? John Burgoyne returned to Britain on parole in the spring of 1778. He faced a storm of criticism, blame for the disaster, questions about his judgment. He demanded a formal inquiry to clear his name. The inquiry mostly exonerated him, blaming lack of support rather than his decisions. But his military career was effectively over. He returned to writing plays and lived until 1792. Horatio Gates became the hero of Saratoga, celebrated across America and Europe. Congress promoted him and gave him command of the Southern Department. There, his luck ran out. At the Battle of Camden in 1780, Gates suffered one of the worst American defeats of the war, fleeing the battlefield and riding nearly 200 miles before stopping. His reputation never recovered. Benedict Arnold recovered from his wound, but continued to clash with other officers and Congress. Passed over for promotion, financially troubled, and married to a loyalist woman. He began secret negotiations with the British in 1779. His plot to surrender West Point was discovered in September 1780, and he fled to British lines. He lived as a British pensioner in London until his death in 1801, despised in America and never fully trusted in Britain. Daniel Morgan continued to serve with distinction, most famously at the Battle of Cowpens in 1781, where he masterminded one of the most tactically brilliant American victories of the war. He retired after the war, served briefly in Congress, and died in 1802, honored and respected. Baron von Riedesel and his wife returned to Germany after being exchanged. Baroness von Riedesel's memoir of the campaign became an important historical source, offering unique insights into the British perspective. And the British and German soldiers who surrendered at Saratoga? Congress never honored the convention, despite the agreement that they'd be allowed to go home. The convention army was held in captivity for the duration of the war. Many ended up in prison camps in Virginia. Many deserted and disappeared into the American population. Some didn't survive. It was a shabby treatment, a violation of the terms. But in the bitter years ahead, both sides would commit worse acts. 247 years later, We can see the Battle of Saratoga clearly for what it was, one of the most consequential military campaigns in world history. It wasn't just about winning or losing a battle. It was about proving that the impossible was possible, that farmers and shopkeepers, fighting for their homes and their belief in self-government, could defeat the professional army of the most powerful empire on earth. It was about demonstrating that new ways of warfare, rifles, irregular tactics, fighting from cover, could overcome traditional military superiority. It was about the power of persistence. The American forces lost ground, took casualties, faced a professional enemy, and didn't quit. They kept fighting, kept adapting, kept showing up, and that persistence paid off. And most critically, Saratoga brought France into the war, transforming a colonial rebellion into a global conflict that Britain couldn't win. Without French money, French troops, French ships, and French diplomatic pressure, American independence would have been far harder to achieve, maybe impossible. Think about that. If Burgoyne had turned back after Freeman's farm, if Arnold hadn't made his wild ride on October 7th, if Gates had been less willing to fight, any of those changes might have prevented Saratoga from becoming the crushing victory it was. No crushing victory, no French alliance, no French alliance, maybe no United States of America. History turns on such moments. The men who fought at Saratoga, British, German, American, most of them were just trying to survive. They followed orders, did their duty, endured terrible conditions, and hoped to get home. They weren't thinking about turning points or world history. They were cold, hungry, scared, and trying not to die. But what they did echoed through the centuries. The democratic republic born in the American Revolution became a model for countless other nations. The principle that people have the right to govern themselves, that authority comes from the consent of the governed. These weren't just American ideas, but they were tested and proven on American battlefields. And Saratoga was the battlefield where those ideas survived their greatest test. Today, you can visit Saratoga National Historical Park, walk the ground where Fraser fell, where Arnold led his charge, where thousands of men fought and bled. It's peaceful now, fields and forests, monuments and markers. But if you close your eyes and listen, you could almost hear the echoes, the rattle of musket fire, the crash of cannon, the cries of wounded men, the turkey call of Morgan's riflemen, the thunder of Arnold's horse as he rode across the battlefield, the silence as 5,791 British and German soldiers laid down their weapons and marched away into captivity. Those echoes changed the world. If you found this deep dive into the Battle of Saratoga valuable, help us continue producing detailed historical content by subscribing to this channel and clicking the notification bell. Share this video with anyone interested in American history, military strategy, or the stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and let us know in the comments. What other Revolutionary War battles should we cover with this level of detail? We read every comment, and your suggestions shape future content. Thank you for learning with us today. Until next time, remember that history isn't just dates and names. It's human beings making choices that echo through time.